And with that, we'll move on to the agenda. So we'll start off with a brief recap of our meeting in April, as well as the work we've done since. And then we'll move on to the presentation of each of the factors that make up the priority areas. That will then lead into a discussion on the composite priority area maps and weights that you all completed in the decision lens exercise. And then if we have time today, I'll go through an example of the qualitative staff analysis and related questions that I'll be evaluating for each project in the plan, and then give you all a chance to provide feedback on those questions. And then we'll talk about what's next, as well as any updates you all may have. So we've actually accomplished a fair amount since our last virtual meeting. We heard your concerns about multiple aspects of the process and decided to hit the reset button to make sure that we had a chance to engage the group in an effective discussion. And then we tried to incorporate every possible suggestion you all provided through the survey on SurveyMonkey on how we measure priority areas. And then almost all of you completed the pairwise exercise from Decision Lens, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. Does anyone have any questions or need any clarification on the work we've done since before we dive into the priority areas? All right, I'll take that as a no. So I think in this process, it's really important to understand the narratives of what we're trying to accomplish in deciding where to invest in bike and pedestrian improvements before we actually decide upon the metrics. So just as a refresher, this is how we as a group decided to approach the key issues and concerns. So in terms of user activity, the idea is to invest in areas with high demand or potential for walking and biking. Obviously, we have some regional limitations. For example, we don't have recent counts, so that brings down our measuring capabilities a bit. But in general, we want to prioritize areas where there's more potential for trip making and for people to make those trips by walking, biking, or using other non-motorized vehicles like a wheelchair or mobility device. The next factor is user comfort. The idea is that we want people to feel as comfortable as possible while engaging in active transportation. That means investing in areas that are not comfortable for the most vulnerable users. The next factor is health disparities. We want to encourage increased physical activity by groups that have disproportionate numbers of chronic health conditions like obesity, heart disease, asthma. And the way we influence that is by investing in infrastructure. The next one is roadway safety, probably the simplest one. We want to invest in areas that are already unsafe for pedestrians and bicyclists. So where are people dying and getting injured while walking or biking? And then the last quantitative factor is roadway congestion. So the idea is to invest in areas that experience congestion issues to encourage people to use alternative modes of travel that are not single occupancy vehicles. And then we decided to measure connectivity as a qualitative factor, which I'll touch on towards the end of the presentation to look at areas where gaps can be filled and connections can be made to improve the overall network connectivity. So with that, I'll go into the maps for each factor and then show you the weights that you all decided on. So these are bike crashes. This is a 7-county regional map. This data is taken from the state's Titan database for the years 2015 to 2019. It represents all crashes, but includes serious injuries and fatalities. And just to be clear, the spots that are darker doesn't mean more severe, it just means more crashes. And as you would imagine, the majority of bike crashes are severe. I know some of you attended the Vision Zero webinar put on by Walk Bike last week. So thank you to Nora, Michael, and Bob for that event. I think it touched on a lot of the same issues we're dealing with in the BPAC. But in that presentation, you all highlighted that the problem areas are state routes. They're the most dangerous roadways in the region, and most of them don't have proper facilities. And because of high speeds and congestion, the non-motorized crashes tend to be severe and sometimes fatal. So as you can see, The majority of crashes are in dense urban areas, downtown Nashville, Murfreesboro, and other areas in the region. And then if we go on to pedestrian crashes, you can see there's a lot more. I know you can't see too clearly on this map, but a lot of them are also concentrated in highly dense walkable areas. And so based on, I think it was 31 pedestrian fatalities in 2019, and then sidewalks and intersection safety improvements are probably our top priorities in the region. And I think you'll all agree with me that this map is unacceptable and shows that it's incredibly unsafe to be a pedestrian in the region. So does anyone have any questions before I move on from safety? All right. So this is user activity, latent demand, or potential demand. This data is sourced from TRIM's data, from TDOT's highway data. And as you can see, the areas with higher potential demand are in more urbanized, dense downtown areas where people are more likely to take shorter trips. This is probably mostly due to the fact that our region is pretty sprawled. So the potential to meet bicycling and walking demands is sometimes best suited investing in connections to transit in areas where there's high demand. So this is bicycle latent demand. And this is pedestrian latent demand. Pretty similar map. Downtown Nashville has the highest demand, more trips. And then this is user comfort, represented in bicycle level of service. This measure gives an overall assessment of the expected level of comfort or suitability for biking based on the presence of bicycle facilities, volumes and speed of traffic, and other corridor conditions. So the idea is that people are more likely to bike when they're more comfortable. So as you can see, Davidson County has a lot of red, a lot of Fs, and so do Murfreesboro and then down in Murray County. A few limitations of this measure: it doesn't take separation into account. So for instance, when we were looking at this the first time, we looked at First Avenue downtown, which has a completely separate biking facility on a segment, and that got a C, when in reality, it's likely that most cyclists will feel more like a B or an A on that roadway. And so this is bicycle level of service, and now we'll move on to pedestrian level of service. A little different. The map doesn't really show any F, which we all know doesn't necessarily reflect real world conditions. But this is pedestrian level of service. Does anyone have any questions or feedback on this map specifically?
Yes, Robert Johnson with Walk Bike Nashville. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
That's great. Sorry, I only just managed to get fully logged on. I mean, yes, I think your aside comment is correct there. That's a very unrealistic map.
Right, and I think that user comfort is not rated the highest, or we will see in our decision lens results that it isn't rated as high as safety. So maybe that will take care of it, but.
This is Justin at WeGo. I'm just curious, like, as far as how this data was generated, because I definitely felt that in looking at the descriptions of the different, level of service, that it didn't quite match up with my, understanding of what existed on those roadways, and if it's relatively correct, I can see the impact of that not being as great, but in some ways it sort of felt like most Bs should be Cs, most Cs should be Ds, that sort of thing. So I'm just curious about how it was generated.
Right. Max or Bob, do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, I know that some of the inputs that are included are the presence of a facility, the volume of the roadway, the speed of the roadway, and the vehicle mix. So how many passenger vehicles as opposed to trucks. So a lot of times where you do see E's and F's, it's where you have a high percentage of trucks. Bob, do you have anything else to add to that? I think you were around during one of the earlier iterations of the LOS for the NPO region.
And what you said is correct. I mean, for example, the demand is not factored in. So, it's looking at a facility, a street, saying how comfortable is this street for a bicyclist or a pedestrian? And the factors are things like, let's say for pedestrians, whether or not you have a sidewalk, obviously that's a factor in how wide that sidewalk is, whether there's on-street parking to provide a buffer, travel volumes, travel speeds, and travel mode. For instance, truck have a bigger impact. Whether a shoulder will give additional separation. So if you have a shoulder, you could end up with a higher level of service than if you did not have a shoulder. So those kind of things, similar to for a bicycle level of service, presence of a bike lane, the width of the street, characteristics of traffic, etc. So, it's just due to the combination of factors. Sometimes you end up with some things that don't seem that intuitive. Most of the time, we dig down a little deeper, you can understand why it's generating that. You may not necessarily agree that, okay, I feel more comfortable on this street than the other one. But I think notwithstanding the fact that some of the times you get non-intuitive results, it's really just a calculation based on factors.
And I saw some questions in the chat on why things change at county line, and that probably goes back to the source of a lot of the information that goes into this. And like you just heard Bob say, it has a lot to do with shoulder and lane width and volumes and things like that all come from TDOT's trims data set. And those segments are always broken at county lines. So where there may be something that's on a portion of a segment, it's going to be represented or broken up at that county line just as a default from the original data set that was used.
Okay, Robert Johnson again. Can I ask another question then to test my understanding of the background here? How would altering the crosswalks or altering the ability to cross those streets, how would that affect the pedestrian level of service on the street, please?
So this is Bob. I'll take that, and you can add in if you want to. It wouldn't. This is looking at travel along a segment, so it does not look at intersections. That would need to be looked at separately. So it's just looking at the segment street with the cross section of that.
Right, which is going to lead to it not prioritizing transit streets. Where there's transit on the street, there's a greater desire to cross the street separate and apart from the land use development on either side of it. And so from Justin's perspective, yeah, this level of service would not reflect crossing the street, which means it wouldn't perhaps serve transit users as well as it could do.
That's right, and I think you gotta take it for what it is, and like I said, it's looking at this segment, so it would indicate to you that, hey, like say you got a poor level of service. Well, you dig deeper and figure out why in that segment do we have a poor level of service, and it could be that you don't have a sidewalk, so you need a sidewalk, or the sidewalk is right up against the street and it needs a buffer. And conversely, you may have a street that has a decent level of service because it has sidewalks, it has buffer or on-street parking, but the crossings are not safe. So I think it's not a complete picture. It's just a part picture as far as the comfort level and the safety for pedestrians or cyclists. There is a need to dig deeper and look, I think, at intersections and crossings.
Yeah, great, thank you.
This is Justin again at WeGo, and yeah, I mean, I think for me, I personally rated this one lower because understanding some of the limitations of it. I mean, I think Robert brought up the point of crosswalks. I think another characteristic that maybe this doesn't capture as much is, on a corridor like Gallatin Pike, the number of curb cuts along. So even if it closer into town has relatively continuous sidewalks, there's constant curb cuts that create lots of opportunities for dangerous situations for pedestrians. But I certainly understand kind of that this is essentially based on the data that can easily be plugged into it, and that's crosswalks and curb cuts might not be as easy to incorporate.
This is Daniel again. I think all those are really good points, and I think that because of the limitations of this measure, it is possible in the qualitative evaluation to correct those limitations. And so when I'm looking at a specific project, I can say, okay, like maybe the segment in this project got a B when it really deserves a D, and I can see what kind of pedestrian accommodations they're providing, and I'll go into this a little bit more into more detail later. But I can say, okay, what are the pedestrian accommodations they're providing, and how can they be improved? And that's sort of more of like a narrative response. But because of the limitations of this data, I really think it is possible to look at whether intersections are safe, even though they're not included in the methodology for level of service. All right, so unless there's
Daniel, hey Daniel, I'm sorry. Can you go back to the bike LOS slide?
Sure.
I get what Max is saying about the data being a direct pull from trims, but I still think I feel like the trends looked weird at the county lines. And again, this was just on just kind of cursory review, reacting to it in real time, but yeah, I don't know. Just that Davidson Wilson County line to me really sticks out, but maybe there's nothing to it. But.
Yeah, and it might just be that white county overline, that separates it, and you can't really see the north-south roads, how they kind of transition. But thanks for pointing that out. We'll look at that a little closer.
Yeah, there is one. I don't know if it's Highway 231 on the south side that goes from level of service D to probably A, which seemed kind of weird.
I think what you're looking at there, Bob, is 109.
Yeah.
That's currently under construction. Has a pedestrian bridge over the Cumberland River into the Gallatin area, but from Highway 24, Highway 70, Lebanon. That's completely under construction.
Yeah, I think you're right.
All right, if there aren't any other points about level of service, I'll move on to the health priority areas. So these are the health priority areas that we decided on. Max, do you want to give a brief overview of the methodology that went into this map? And then John, I don't know if you're on the call, but feel free to add anything in as well.
Yeah, these were taken from populations that were identified as having disproportionate rates of chronic illnesses that are attributable to low activity or not having physical activity. And so I believe, without having the information in front of me, that's like asthma, obesity, COPD, and heart disease. And where those populations occur within our region, we looked at the demographic data that underlies that, found the certain populations that were the highest correlations. And those were, and Daniel, you may have to help me with this, elderly, young, minority, and low income. And so each of those are then basically weighted against the regional average. So you get a 1 if your census tract, I believe these are, if that is above the regional average for the percentage of that certain population. So the values that you would see here range from basically 0 of those populations being present at a rate greater than the regions, all the way up to 4. So that would be all 4 of the populations I just mentioned going over. We're looking at improving this some. I think we have some modeled data that'll allow us to get a little bit better granularity below the census tract information. This is used from our population synthesizer that we use with our travel demand model, as well as work that we've been doing with the Department of Health and John Vick. I think John's on the line, so maybe he can mention it a little bit, but pre-COVID, we were in discussions with them on helping to get discharge data to try and find out a little bit more information on where these specific populations might be located. But obviously that probably took the back seat to more important things that they've got going on.
Max, those 4 populations were poverty, elderly, unemployed, and carless.
I was close.
Yeah.
Hey, this is John. I am on the call and from the health department. And I think, yeah, so Max is correct. We were talking about using hospital discharge data. And that allows us to look at every hospitalization that happens in these counties for whatever disease diagnosis we want to look at. So it would probably be something similar to what Max mentioned, things like COPD, respiratory illness, heart disease, hypertension, things that are chronic conditions that are related to being physically active and therefore related to active transportation options. I think what's here, the health priority areas, are probably not going to look drastically different than if we used hospital discharge data. I think the hospital discharge data would give us it would probably identify a few areas that health priority areas don't currently. And it would be a little bit more specific as well. So, it would also capture the most severe areas of the counties. So we'd be capturing essentially people's interactions with hospitals, and so we could look at both inpatient and outpatient hospitalizations. So we were working on that before COVID. Myself, along with a lot of the other data people, have been pulled into doing COVID-related work, and so we have not had an opportunity to pull the data, but we definitely have it available, and it's certainly something that we could utilize. If we can't get it set up this year, it might be something that we could do for next year.
Thanks, John. Does anyone have any immediate reactions to that?
It's Bill McCord over at Gallatin. Can you hear me?
Yes, Bill.
I was curious to know what's the intent of the outcome of incorporating these measures. Is it to try to indicate that where these various at-risk populations need more sidewalks to improve their quality of life, or is this a behavioral issue? Or is this, because I'm sure there are places that may not have those characteristics, which do not have sidewalks, but yet have, let's say, good, healthy outcomes. So are we trying to put a link here that the lack of facilities results in poor health of the area population? Or what's the purpose of infusing these health data into the facilities?
I think the idea is that areas where there are more of those populations and where people suffer from chronic health conditions related to physical activity, I think the idea is that investing in sidewalks, bike lanes, any sort of active transportation infrastructure would facilitate more increased physical activity, which would mitigate the chronic health problems that those communities feel.
Okay, but wouldn't we also tend to think that also places where there are no such facilities, then we would expect poor health outcomes?
Hey, this is John from the health department. So not necessarily. We know that there's enough research now that shows that people's environments do impact their behavior in terms of active transportation. So if you create new opportunities for people to walk and bike, then they will. So increasing access to infrastructure does change behavior and increase use of that infrastructure. But there are many other things that determine people's health as well related to chronic conditions. So we know that it's not a direct correlation to say that, if you have bike lanes and sidewalks in your neighborhood, that you're automatically going to be healthier than someone who doesn't have those things, because there are so many other factors at play. But we do know that if you increase access, then it does promote more walking and biking, and does lead to more walking and biking.
How much of it has to do with personal behavior?
So those are all factors. So it's not an either or. We know that there's an aspect of personal choice, and there's also access as well. So when the research looks at changes in behavior based on access, it controls for prior behavior. So we know that all things equal, if you increase access to something, people will use it more often than before. But yeah, there's certainly a personal choice and personal behavior as well. And things like obesity and heart disease, they're not just impacted by physical activity; they're impacted by diet and exercise outside of walking and biking. So those are all factors at play. Chronic disease epidemiology is very complex, but we know that if there's something that we can do to promote more walking and biking, give people those opportunities, we know that can lead to better health outcomes.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I just wondered how much of a weighted factor that this is going to play in decision making and ranking of facilities. If this is considered a primary variable that we would want to measure and use it for scoring priorities.
Yeah,
So Bill,
and I think that's what.
Bill,
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Go for it, John. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, I was just saying, yeah, and I think that's what this group is tasked with doing, is deciding how high we want to prioritize the health priority areas versus some of the other things that we're including.
Right, exactly.
So I'm going to
Robert,
go ahead and go for it.
Excuse me, Robert Johnson. I actually used health priority areas in choosing some of my programs a couple of years ago. So I possibly add to the previous comments to Bill McCord there by saying that it introduced an equity component to the process. I was choosing schools. I can only allocate a certain amount of my time to certain schools, and I decided to select schools to do Safe Routes to Schools programming at. And I used the health priority areas as one of my factors for deciding which schools I was going to choose. And because one of the factors is income level as well as car ownership, it correlated very well with low income. And then, as John has said, the other health factors are good describers of disadvantaged communities. So I found that these health priority areas, specifically from an active transport point of view, helped me introduce equity, particularly to do with financial equity, into my selection process. So I quite like this for that reason.
Well, then likewise, is there data available that would indicate in those communities with, in, let's say, those health issues or car ownership issues that also have sidewalks? Do we have information that indicates that the health outcomes are better in these, I don't know the term that was used, disadvantaged areas, when they do have facilities?
Right, good question. I don't know. I mean, obviously in central Manhattan, there's very low car ownership, and they're all walking about all over the place, and they certainly don't want car ownership to become healthier. So as John was saying, it's not a direct correlation. Fair point.
Yeah, and I would just say that, there's a large and growing body of research that looks at exactly that question, and what they've found is that, yes, when you do control for other factors, the presence of infrastructure for walking and biking does lead to better health outcomes.
So in communities or neighborhoods that have a sufficient or I would guess good infrastructure for pedestrian and bicycle facilities, regardless of controlling for income or car ownership or any things like this, then we should see equal health outcomes. Is that right? Or is this some other thing other than the availability of sidewalks or bike paths driving the health issues in certain areas?
Well, so again, I'll say that there are many different factors at play when you're talking about chronic disease health outcomes, but the research that's done on the presence of infrastructure and access to that is controlling for the other variables. So we're essentially trying to isolate the infrastructure piece and say, if everything else is equal, if you have access to walking and biking infrastructure, you're more likely to use it and you have better health outcomes.
Right, but that would be the case of all populations, right?
Yes, correct. But I'm going to go the next step forward from the others and say that I believe that disadvantaged communities will benefit disproportionately from those improvements. John Vick, is that a radical statement that I've just made, or is that also true?
Oh, so yeah. So so for disadvantaged populations, yes, they have the potential to benefit more from the improvements than others. Yes, that is true.
If they take advantage of the facilities and use them.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's that component as well.
Yeah.
Where we do know that increasing access does increase use, But I think, and Robert could probably speak to this as well. There's certainly sort of a community engagement and education component that goes with that as well to promote use.
Well, that'd be true of every population, though. Even the wealthiest or the non-disadvantaged, if you provide a facility, they're going to increase the use of it. Are they going to be is simply because of income or some level of disadvantageous criteria going to mean that a lower income person is going to use a facility more than someone who's not if it's given the same facility?
No, actually, I think it's even better than that statement, Bill. It is that given equal access by building it and equal education by encouraging it, the disadvantaged person will actually benefit more by using the infrastructure the same amount as the advantaged person, because their level of disadvantage is caused by issues all across the board, and therefore the gain they get from any given improvement is greater than the gain that an advantaged person who is already slightly fitter, slightly healthier, slightly wealthier, has slightly better hospital access, has slightly better grocery store access, than the benefit that person gets. The same 1 mile walked has a greater benefit for a disadvantaged person than for an advantaged person. Is that correct, John?
Yeah, that was very well said, Robert.
Okay, I think it'd be good to reference any of those studies that you are talking about that support that data in the plan. If this criteria is going to be heavily weighed.
Christopher Stowe, if I could jump in here, I am familiar with a study that was done in Toronto, which is obviously not going to be a one-to-one correlation, but they studied low-income neighborhoods that were more walkable, and they actually quantified the difference in body mass index and blood pressure and so forth. And if you read these results, it is significant, and I'm happy to email that to the group if anyone is interested in reading this more quantitative data.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to read, yes.
Yeah, I second that.
I'll shoot it over to you when we're done here.
And the CDC has also done a literature review of this, and they've done a really nice synthesis of it as well.
If I could ask I'm sorry. I was just going to say, if I could just ask I'm kind of naive to this, not knowing the details, but are we seeing those kinds of benefits primarily from folks that are using these facilities for recreational purposes, commuting? Is it kids that are walking to school? Or are there kind of nuances to how these facilities, would be best implemented to take advantage of those benefits? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's probably going to depend on the study as to whether they teased out if people are using the infrastructure for recreation versus commuting. I know that there's quite a bit of research that looks just strictly at commuting itself and the presence of sidewalk ways commuting purposes. And I know that there have been significant findings for commuting alone. As far as recreation, I think it would probably just depend on the study as to whether they were including all types of uses of facilities versus whether they were teasing out commuting versus recreation. I think it's just going to depend on the study. But I know that for commuting at least, there are a number of studies that look strictly at that.
Cool, thank you.
And Bill, just to reiterate and to answer your question, this has already been said a little bit, but I think even though there are a bunch of factors that go into these priority areas, the one that we can control through the evaluation of projects in the Unified Plan is the infrastructure aspect. And so while the equity portion of making sure that disadvantaged communities have lower rates of chronic health conditions is sort of everyone in society in every aspect is working towards that, we in the Unified Plan can control the infrastructure aspect. So that's really that's the main lens that we're looking at this through.
Daniel, and I'm going to tread on John Vick's toes again here. If you were looking at land use, then things like density and mixed use are also shown to impact things like opportunities for disadvantaged communities. So not just transport infrastructure, but land use and particularly housing infrastructure as well would be significant things that we would hope the GNRC is going to be able to control, or impact.
Right, I agree with you there. That's a good point. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the congestion aspect before we get into the actual priority area maps. So this is volume to capacity ratio. This is taken from INRIC's data. So the idea is how much the road can handle versus how much is actually on the road. So basically, roadways that have exceeded capacity are great candidates for investing in bike ped infrastructure, as that can lead to mode switching, which tends to alleviate congestion. So this is volume to capacity ratio. Does anyone have any questions before I show the results of the decision lens? I think that'll probably clear up a lot of thoughts about each of the factors.
Well, I'll be able to.
A question came in about peak hour capacity for the volume capacity image. Is this just looking at peak hour?
Yeah, so this information comes from the travel demand model, not INRIC's. So it's not speed related as much as it is volume related. And this is the worst peak hour of the day for that specific link. So it's not AM peak, it's not PM peak, it's not midday, but it is the worst point for each link during the entire day. The worst case scenario.
All right, I'm going to move on to the decision lens results.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question.
Oh.
This Bill.
Go for it.
Would these maps be available on the website? I was not authorized to download the video portion of this meeting, so I'd like to look at some of those examples.
I'll be sending a copy of the slides in PDF form to the whole group, so you'll have access to the maps.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so here are the decision lens results. As you can see, safety is much more important than the others at around 43%. User activity is at around 19%. User comfort is at 15%. Health at 14%, and congestion at 9%. So 17 out of the 19 voters of BPAC completed the exercise, which I thought was awesome. So thanks for being engaged. Does anybody have any immediate reactions to these results?
How many people responded?
17 people, Bill.
Okay.
Daniel, this is Bob. When we're talking about roadway safety, that is measured just in crash results?
Yeah, here, I'll go to the next slide to make that a little bit more clear. So this is how each factor is broken up.
That's right. Yeah, I had forgotten, but I guess my only comment on that, I mean, I agree that road safety is a high priority or should weighted highly. The only caveat to that, I would say, is, sometimes just because you don't crash doesn't mean that it's safe. So obviously, we know if we have the crashes, then we've probably got a problem. So that's good, but I think also situations where sometimes they don't pop up for various reasons.
Yeah, I would certainly second Bob there in that if no one is walking and cycling, then there won't be any crashes, and therefore it won't feature as a dangerous location using only historic data, which I think was some of the questions I was asking about whether user activity latent demand could be used to foresee crashes and judge the safety of somewhere that doesn't currently have many pedestrians or cyclists.
FDOT may have some good information about that because essentially they are a 12 months of accurate data because of the weather conditions they normally have. They've done a lot of study on that. Might be some good data from there. They have similar development characteristics as Tennessee. I'm not sure it'd be good to compare Tennessee and the Nashville metro area with New York or Toronto or some larger city.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks for that.
I guess my suggestion or question to the group would be, are there studies that are out there that might lend to places where there are not crashes, but there are safety issues, so that it would give priority to that area, even if the incidents aren't there to back it up, similar to like a roadside safety audit review that the state does for automobiles primarily, but I know that they do some that are non-pedestrian as well. I'm sure Metro has some sort of study. And Peter, I think I saw you were on it. Are those out there that could be used, or maybe that should be used?
This is Rochelle. I think that TDOT's trying to get to that place, but of course it's pretty difficult doing predictive crashes. I mean, we do know that when you have we do know the characteristics of roadways that have a higher crash rate. So if we're widening roads or increasing speeds, increasing width, increasing the length that it takes people to cross the road on foot, that should increase pedestrian crashes. So there's things like that. I'm not sure of the exact research. I agree with you, Max, that it's probably out there. But at the moment we know what kinds of roadways have a disproportionate amount of crashes.
Yeah, this is Peter. It's a tough question. I think that you get into sort of those gray areas between our factors when you start trying to quantify the potentiality of something that doesn't currently exist, and that's what makes it difficult. I think that the best recommendations and research I've seen nationally have kind of focused on the spectrum of speed and then exposure to speed. Basically, and not just speed but volume as well. The higher speeds and volumes of a roadway, the more protection and separation you need between people walking and biking and people driving. And that can kind of guide some of our recommendations. Maybe the only thing I can think of right now at Metro that could be useful for that is our walk and bike master plan that does give recommended facilities. And so it may show something that we see as a 5-year, like within the next 5 years, priority for building bike infrastructure not on the ground yet, so it's something that we see as a priority, but it's, for the most part, there aren't facilities on the ground right there. But it's still gonna give it a limited picture. It may just show the kind of priority in what we see as our 5-year bikeway network build out. And that's also just limited to Davidson County. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but again, we would love as much as we can to correlate with local master plans.
Peter, I think one thing that I just took away from what you said, and it may be the thought of the group as well, is that the areas that are of the highest priority are those that are high speed, high volume. And what the roadway safety factor right now shows is areas where people are walking and biking, which are typically not your high speed, not your high volume. They're actually your low speed, low volume, where people are feeling safe to walk and ride their bike, but because of the prevalence of them out there, they're getting hit because of exposure. So
I think
based on
I think
what
it's
you
true
said,
and
it's
also
like
not
totally
true.
counterintuitive.
Yeah, I think that I don't know if people are kind of familiar with the idea of the invisible cyclist, kind of the people who are out there biking not because they choose to, but because they need to get around, who don't typically make it into a lot of our statistics and data. I think those are the people who are out there biking on our major pikes, and they're typically the ones who are bearing the brunt of the worst crashes, who are getting killed using the street. And so I think there are a lot of people who are actually biking and walking on major pikes or just the high speed, high volume roadways. But it's more difficult to capture that, and they're doing that because that is their only option.
I would take issue with that because personally, I know I wind up on a lot of those places because it's hard to get anywhere in the area without using some of those roads.
Max, what's the potential to change the methodology at this point to account for predictive crashes based on things?
I'm here to serve you guys. Is the easy answer. The hard answer is predictive crashes. I mean, that's something that I think everybody wishes that they could do, wishes that they had time that they could do.
Right.
I think the option that we have, though, is to work with the tools that we have. Back to what Peter was saying, speed and volume, those are captured in bicycle service and pedestrian level of service. It's just using the tools for what they are to identify the priority areas. So like safety, the way that he described it is kind of a combination of roadway safety and user comfort. And potentially latent demand if you get to what Robert was saying, where it's that exposure part too. So it's all of it together, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to do is make a composite of where that priority is. My personal opinion, I don't steer you guys, but my personal opinion is that 43% on roadway safety where crashes have happened as opposed to could happen really narrows down where that priority area is. There's not very many locations where there's a lot of pedestrian and bicycle crashes, and almost 50% of the BPAC priority is focused in 50 grid cells out of the 500,000 that we have.
Mm-hmm. Because of the safety. Well, what about if we're widening roads? We know that that will increase traffic volume, right, to a certain number, and the MPO predicts that. Is there a way to weight a predictive crash? I guess, a predictive crash rate based on the expected number of vehicles and their speed and the width of the road and all these things that we do now lend to higher crash rates?
There is a way to model it, not one that I'm comfortable doing. I think we've had discussions with Department of Safety on it, and it's it's just a little bit beyond what we're ready to take on at this point. But I think it does lend into what Daniel talks about with the critical eye, you know, kind of that narrative where if the project is recommending a widening so that there's higher volumes, higher speeds, and it's in a priority area or in an area close to a priority area, he can kind of make that judgment call.
Yes, he can qualitatively, and I think that would be a good thing to do. I'm just unsure of how that actually influences the final decision. That's all.
This is Daniel. I think that Max is right. I can make that judgment call. And so, like, for instance, if I'm looking at a road widening, I can say, if you're adding bike facilities, they should probably be separated by a buffer or a completely separate facility, because we know, based on what we've just been talking about, traffic speeds and congestion levels, that it wouldn't necessarily be a safe place for people to bike. And so that is something I can do. Sean, do you have any idea how much that actually weighs in, or how much that can actually change the project proponent's design?
I think that's a good point to bring up. You know, I think this is where we kind of have to acknowledge our like level of influence as staff, is that I don't know if Daniel mentioned this, but in our call for projects, the breakdown of project types that we've received so far is about 60% of those 350 plus projects are road widening projects. And so just kind of working under that assumption and acknowledging the types of proposals and funding requests we're receiving from the local governments that are, you know, matching the funds on projects. You know, we're assessing those projects based on our goals and objectives, and can provide, you know, analysis and some suggestions for enhancements to optimize those projects. But it's not always a guarantee that, you know, we'll be able to. This is, I think Bill's a good example of submitting projects on behalf of Gallatin, where you know, we can have a healthy back and forth discussion of, as part of this,
Right.
you know, road widening project, Bill, you know, we think that there might be an opportunity to improve safety through separated facilities, but that might add cost onto the project as well, or not be, you know, well received within the local community. And so, you know, I think active transportation is one component that will be providing some analysis or recommendations to improve projects based on, you know, the goals and objectives that we've identified. But it's also something that carries over for you know, recommendations of incorporating transit within project design, or environmental considerations within project design. So our hope, I think, is that it'll inform the evaluation of the Unified Transportation Plan and inform that prioritization process. But I think where it also can be influential is a lot of these projects are still very conceptual. And so as these projects move through the project development process, you know, maybe the consideration of a bicycle lane is all the local government is willing to commit to right now. But as years go by, and, you know, as the, you know, cultural changes or design standards may change, that they might be more or more receptive to incorporating a separated facility or something that we would recommend, you know, later on as the project goes through the design process and maybe gets programmed within the TIP. Sorry, that was a little bit longer.
Hey, Rochelle. Rochelle, this is Max. I guess I have a question as to what can we provide to Multimodal to provide you the evidence that's needed to either request or support the inclusion of transportation facilities on a project where either we think it's needed or the local thinks it's needed.
Are you talking about for TDOT projects?
Correct. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
local projects, is a little bit easier to negotiate with or make them aware of, a regional proposal. But as far as working with a TDOT project, typically those are the things that either get scoped out or never get scoped in the first place.
Mm-hmm. How many do you have? Can I ask that? How many TDOT projects are were submitted for the?
I think that there's approximately 50, I think.
50? Okay. I mean, one, we're allies, right? And if the locals want it, in particular, that really helps us. I think, do you have some examples of projects that were submitted that don't have what are, projects that should include sidewalks and bike lanes? Because I haven't personally been brought into that discussion. I'm sure like OCT staff have, or maybe they haven't. I don't know.
Hey, Rochelle, I have a question related to that.
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple of bridge replacement projects on Highway 31 here in Gallatin.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to be in touch early on, including involving Jonathan Russell through the TCC, who sits with TDOT, and trying to ensure that we have adequate facilities constructed on these replacement bridges over Crupple Creeks that they are scheduling.
Right.
And that we have in our plan to construct, of course, sidewalks ultimately, mostly by developers as they're developing or redeveloping properties up and down the road, but also a greenway project to be able to accommodate those when they reconstruct these bridges.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, I think it's being accepted pretty well, but I'm somewhat skeptical, and I don't know what's telling me this, that maybe our requests are not going to be fully considered and or included in the new design of these bridges.
Mm-hmm.
So
go ahead.
I'm concerned about that, and I'm not sure. Can't speak for our engineering department, but there may be other places where that is a concern as well.
Oh, for sure. Well, I can answer that one first and then go back to Max's question. But so the progress that's been made is having the multimodal design guidelines. And so now each and every project is evaluated for the kinds of sidewalks and bike lanes that should be added to a project when they're in design on the early end. So I'm not sure, Bill, where your projects are, like if they're already in environmental review, where of course it makes it harder to add those things, or if maybe they're Improve Act projects. I'm not sure what you're talking about, but so they're
I think they're Improve Act projects.
Okay. Well, for those we have not knowing exactly which ones you're talking about, there's a better chance that we can get that infrastructure included in the project. So, I mean, the process is for the engineers to refer to the multimodal guidelines when they're designing the projects in the first place, add them to the project. If they don't, the multimodal staff, like me and one other person, reviews all the projects and make sure that the appropriate infrastructure is added. So if I see one in Gallatin, I am more than happy to reach out to you directly and see where things are, and vice versa.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the idea then is that, yes, they'll design it and maybe even construct it, but does that mean the city's going to be paying for the difference?
Oh, well, I mean, that's
that I was not.
No, I know. What I've observed is that the city or the MPO is asked to pay for infrastructure that goes above and beyond the multimodal design guidelines. So if you want a separated bike lane or a separated sidewalk on a road that, you know, is don't quote me on this, but it's things that go above and beyond what the multimodal design guidelines ask for.
Yeah, like
That's
lines
where-
and stuff on the pillars and stuff.
Lines on the pillars?
Yeah, you know, statues and things like that.
Oh, no. I mean actual safety infrastructure, but things that
Okay.
are, you know, above what is called for in the multimodal design guidelines.
Okay.
So it could be something like if you want a separated bike lane that's 10 feet away from the roadway, TDOT may be asking Gallatin to pay for that separation. And that they will only pay for what's in the multimodal design guidelines, which may be a 5-foot sidewalk with a 2-foot buffer or something. I don't know. You know, I don't know the specifics, but that's what I've seen observed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't
Okay,
want to
and
take
then-
up the time on that. It's just an example.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And
Rochelle, couldn't that be an opportunity for the MPO to apply some of their SDBG funding to, you know, for that supplement if
It
they
would
feel
be.
like it's, yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, is this Sean?
Yeah.
It would be definitely, but I understand that the MPO only has a limited availability of STBG funds, right? But yes, the MPO could be asked to step in and pay for that with STBG funds or whatever.
I think that, Rochelle, this is great. I think this is a really good discussion because I think we can, you know, kind of start going back to that question of like, if we're going to be proposing going above that minimum design standard to identify improvements for projects, then just kind of knowing the like financial implications of that and the likely pushback, and then being able to kind of support that with these potential funding opportunities. I may ask Anna too. I know we have the active transportation program, and sometimes that program is only funding, you know, phases of a particular active transportation project. And I don't know if there's been any applications in the past. You're familiar with it as well, but I don't know if there's been any applications in the past where someone has kind of leveraged a existing TIP project to support kind of enhanced bike ped facilities. Either of you, if you have like knowledge of that, or there aren't any, just feel free to chime in.
Hey guys, this is Anna. We had a project in Mount Juliet that involved widening of what was that? Mount Juliet Road that goes over I-40 right there near that large developed area.
Providence.
Yeah, Providence.
You always want to call it Turkey Creek, but that's in Knoxville, but that's very stuck in my head for some reason. Anyway, Mount Juliet wanted multimodal facilities on that widening project that for whatever reason, and I don't know the story behind it, but TDOT wasn't agreeable to paying for. So Mount Juliet secured the funding for the through us, and combine that into the widening project that TDOT was doing.
But Mount Juliet paid for it, like 100% of it.
The multimodal facility.
Mm-hmm.
They secured funding through us.
Oh, through the MPO.
Matching portion, but
yeah. And how many years ago was that? Because the multimodal access guidelines have only been in place for less than 2 years.
It's been in the last couple of years.
Okay.
That's correct.
It involved extending the bridge over Interstate 40 to provide sidewalk and bike lanes.
Right.
And we came to a solution of expanding it on one side and not having to completely restructure the bridge.
Okay, I think I'm remembering this project. And I think that some of the discussions were happening. So I think that was before that, sorry, there's a dog in the background. I think that was before the multimodal access, why do I keep calling it that? Multimodal roadway design guidelines were in place. So at this point, you have a stronger case to make that TDOT should be paying for the sidewalks and bike lanes and not having to rely necessarily on MPO funds. None of these are hard and fast rules. There's nothing in state policy that says you have to provide sidewalks and bike lanes. But TDOT is doing a much better job at that since the design guidelines have been in place. Is what I'll say. And I do want to go back to Max's first question, which I can't necessarily answer right now because I haven't seen the project list from TDOT that asks or doesn't ask for multimodal facilities.
Rochelle, one thing I'm sorry, I'm sorry to cut you off.
It's okay.
I will say, as far as the MPO being able to influence the projects that TDOT is delivering, you guys are going through your planning environmental linkages process and being able to inform the purpose and need and some of the kind of necessary components that need to be addressed, to meet that is probably an opportunity area I could see where you guys go to TDOT and you're directly informing what's coming out of NEPA by saying, look, we've documented a pedestrian or cyclist safety issue, or we've got latent demand, or whatever kinds of analysis are done to support the need for these cyclist and pedestrian improvements through that earlier on through that planning environmental linkages process.
Yeah. Yes, and I agree. And we're also trying to get even earlier in the process. So when documents are coming out of the, the STID department, Strategic Transportation Investments, where it's even before NEPA, we have an even better shot. And so that's where, so in 15 minutes, I have to get off this call and join another call to talk about something Anna and I have talked about recently, which is the State Route 6 project in Spring Hill and Thompson Station, and the need for sidewalks and bike lanes there. So it's early enough in the process that it's, we have some opportunity to weigh in and try to do what we can to get bicycle pedestrian facilities, but so we are doing that generally. I just don't know the answer to Max's question, which is okay, you have 50 projects, TDOT submitted them to the MPO. What can Rochelle do at this point?
Rochelle, it wasn't meant as a pointed question. I think it was meant as a cooperative question, not one that you have to answer on the spot. But I think that's the key for how the BPAC can best interact with TDOT to get projects not necessarily that address just what the state wants, but address what the state wants to accomplish with the project, as well as what the region and the locals want to accomplish with the project. So let's go hold hands and figure it out.
Right.
Yeah. I think this is definitely worth more discussion because we touched on it a lot, which is the perceived safety issue. And I don't know what we could even provide to Rochelle for a project like Charlotte Pike widening of, there may not be crashes there currently, but they're going to widen the road.
Yep.
What we don't want TDOT to just provide the minimum design standards, like a 5-foot sidewalk, because that might actually exacerbate safety issues. And so, what other types of information could we support you with to, help?
That one's a great example. Yes, absolutely.
But I think exploring those opportunities, could be another potential agenda topic. I know we kind of occupied more time than you wanted us to, Daniel, but I think this is something worth digging into.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's okay. This is a really good discussion that I think needs to be had, because the design of the projects is super important. And so if we get projects that, or get projects from TDOT specifically that that go above and beyond the multimodal guidelines, then it'll be easier for us through this methodology to rank them higher, and so that they'd be more likely to get funding. So in the interest of time, since we only have around 15 minutes left, I'm going to go ahead and show the priority maps. So we did two versions. Max, do you want to go through the methodology of how all those factors actually and the weights fit into the maps?
Sure. So can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
Sorry. Obviously, the X's align with the two different priority areas, one being pedestrian, one being bicycle. Each of the values that you see in the measure category were then indexed 0 to 1. So like the level of service, there's actually a numerical value that determines what that lettering is. And so the highest value would have been given a 1, the lowest value would have been given a 0 for each of these. Go to the next slide. Each of those indices were multiplied by the percentage weight that came out of the voting that you guys did, and then applied. So the scores that you see are anywhere between 0 and I think like 60, somewhere between 59 and 60 for both the bicycle priority area and the pedestrian priority area are the range of values that you would see. There's no rhyme or reason to those numbers. Just wanted to give you a sense of scale. We showed them in two different ways because I wanted to point something out that I saw in just looking at the information. So when I did a natural breaks, it put it where it looks like this. It appears as if the health priority areas have a larger weight than you would expect. And I thought that was a little odd. So I did equal breaks using just 4, and they disappeared. So what this tells us is that most of the health priority areas that don't have underlying network attributes, so that would be the crashes, that would be the level of service, that would be the latent demand, anything that doesn't have a roadway influence to it, has a value somewhere between 10 and 15, which is very, very minimal. But it does distract from the map. So here's what it looks like, equal interval just in 4 groupings as opposed to the 5 and natural breaks.
So these are the bike priority areas, and then here's a zoom. So this is before Max's team put them into quartiles, and this is after. So you see how the health priority areas sort of go away, and it makes a little bit more sense. And then this is the first time around for the pedestrian priority areas. And then with the second methodology, that's what that looks like.
This Bill over in Gallatin, again, I can't see those maps, but I'm kind of curious if the results of the maps and the weighting factors of each of these variables indicate some obvious breaks or gaps in the system that would just don't make sense to not complete a facility, a bikeway or bike lane facility for an extended period if you have a quarter-mile gap or something in there or less. Does this data create gaps in a continuous system?
Bill, I'll say from the data side of things, because of the high weight of safety, which was crashes, you predominantly just see urban areas and the pikes show up, there are some breaks along those major radial arterials that come out of downtown in Murfreesboro and Gallatin and Lebanon and Franklin. But in terms of it showing a long continuous priority area, you don't really see those beyond the where the bike level of service kind of pops out in the rural areas.
Okay.
I would say that every single one of these maps you've shown us shows Wilson County as some sort of halcyon walking and cycling heaven, and that is again reflected on this map as well, as it was with the level of service maps that everyone was questioning. There's definitely something going on with Wilson County data. Let me suggest that.
I would say it's showing that we are a good bicycle destination. And you know that to be a fact, Robert. We're miles ahead of the other counties.
No, it's true. I've even been there by train to use your bicycle playground. I mean, what else can I say?
I will add, Bob, I did look into the level of service on bike, because that was kind of tugging at me. And all of the examples that I found where it went from a level of service like A or B to a D or F, there's a significant increase in shoulder width once you get to Wilson County.
And the picture that you showed in the chat, that's a good demonstration. That is a problem area coming in on Old Lebanon Dirt Road, which is being addressed by the Mount Juliet BPAC and Public Works. It is in need of bike facilities and pedestrian facilities, and currently has no shoulder. And coming out of Davidson County, it is quite dangerous. But that was a good picture where you were concerned about how the trend changes from Davison to Wilson.
So I think what I'm hearing is that we're not all in agreement on these maps, and that we need a little bit more time and discussion to support the weighting of the factors and how they are translated into maps. Does that sound like something? Does that sound true to everybody?
No. I think that's an extreme reaction from my perspective. No, I wouldn't say the maps need to be revised. I must say I am interested in Wilson County's depiction on all of the maps, but no, I don't think I'd go so far as to say what you just said.
Okay. So going forward, I think we'll be sending out a survey to gauge everyone's support of the maps and see if anyone has comments. But if people are in support, I think the next steps, especially for the next meeting, is to go through an example of the qualitative evaluation with the 5 staff analysis questions, so that we can sort of wrap up the evaluation portion of how BPAC plugs into the unified plan. But since we're nearing 1 o'clock, in the interest of time, I'll thank everybody for the great discussion today. And does anybody have any updates that they'd like to say?
Well, I'll mention this bill over in Gallatin, that on June the 4th, GNRC will be conducting a virtual meeting for our Plan Gallatin preferences and or scenarios, and this will be, we'll see how this works out.
Christopher Stowe
is now exiting.
So I invite you to, if you're interested to participate in that, you could go to our website and log on. It's from 6 to 7 p.m. Sorry.
Thanks, Bill. So going forward, I'll send everyone a copy of all these slides and the maps for y'all to look over. But thank you everyone for your participation in today's call.
Thank you for hosting it, and we'll look forward to that.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Daniel.
Okay. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Multiple people are now exiting.